increasing diversity in innovation. And our topic leader here is then Suzanne Harrison. Suzanne is an author, patent futurist, economist with a long list of merits. And I have chosen some of those. Since 1995, she has led a group called ICM Gathering, a group of 20 companies that meet regularly around best practices in IP management. She's also founder and principal of Percipence LLC, advising and focusing on IP strategy, management, and IP risk. And Suzanne is also the originator behind the Diversity Pledge, now signed by 40 companies. So, handing over to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. And I'm really excited to follow up after Katrine's talk, because really that highlights the lack of diversity that we've had in innovation and the need to actually open our eyes and open our thoughts to different perspectives. And I'm really excited that we have a great panel of company folks who can talk and share their experiences. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and they can, as they speak, can spend a little more time. So with me here in the room, I have Mike Hatrick, who's the Group Director and IP Strategy and Portfolio for Volvo Group. You've seen him over the last day and a half as the introduction, so you know him. His colleague, Tove Audhav, is a Senior Research Engineer, Fuel Cells, also at Volvo Group, which is exciting to have more of an R&D perspective. And then on the camera, we have Robertha Höglud, who's the Head of IP for Elkem. We have Laure Gisler, who's the former Global Head of IP for Polestar, and Laure van Oudheusden, the Head of IP of Precision Diagnosis at Royal Philips. So it'll be an interesting panel, and I just want to say that it's really exciting that it's more women than men. So it so happens so infrequently, I just want to call that out. So I'm actually going to start with Robertha. And the first question that I have for you is, can you talk a little bit about each of your companies' views or how they define diversity and innovation? So Robertha, we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. In Elkem, the company that I work for, that it's a materials company, we produce sustainably silicon and silicones. We see diversity and innovation with two dimensions. We look at women and at how many women we have, and also the different nationalities that we have. Elkem is a truly global company. So we have people from at least 30 nationalities. So that's how we look at innovation and diversity. We look at cultural background and gender.
Okay, great. Laure, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like at Philips?
Okay, great. So yes, at Philips, we really believe that a diverse workforce, but also an inclusive work environment are really essential for a purpose-led innovative business, because we can better understand our customers and better identify their needs when we have a diverse workforce that mirrors our worldwide customer base. So diversity is indeed an important part of our purpose, and it's one of the pillars of our global human resource strategy. But what we also realize is that diversity has many dimensions, and we like to see it as an iceberg, where we have really a small number of items that are visible, like skin color, gender, but also age. A few that are not so visible, or maybe half visible, half invisible, like nationality, but also physical ability, ethnicity, culture, religion. But we have a lot more dimensions that are completely invisible unless you know the person. And these are also items that make a diverse environment and a diverse team, such as thinking style. I'm looking at the iceberg now. Personality profile, education, talents, value systems, but also sexual orientation, work style, location. And all of this is what we are trying to improve in the way that we build our teams. So diversity has many dimensions indeed, but of course we need to start somewhere, especially when we want to make progress. So gender parity is also where it starts. And that's why we have increased the number of women at the top from 19% in 2018 to 28% in 2021. And we have also a new goal of 30% gender diversity in senior leadership positions by the end of 2025. If we compare this with overall gender diversity in the company, we are at the moment at 39%, I believe, in 2020, which is great. And you also see that there is still room to improve between the goal of 30% by 2025 and the overall diversity that we already have at about 40%. So yeah, that's the goal that we have, and that's what we are working on. But on top of that, what is very important, and even maybe more important, is to make sure that we increase the level of feeling included. Because what we also noticed is that women at the top in the past tend to feel often less included when they climb the ranks. And now we can say that that feeling has improved a lot, because women at the top now feel as included as men do. So that these are the scores that we got during engagement surveys. But diversity is not enough, as I mentioned. It really has to include an inclusive culture, and that's where we put also a lot of effort, because only when the difference is actually diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And actually what we want is to have an inclusive culture so that these diverse capabilities and opinions and perspectives are effective and are taken into account in the decision-making process.
Yeah, that's a really good definition. And we're going to come back to that concept of inclusivity in just a few moments. Mike, do you want to tell us a little bit about Volvo Group?
Yeah, sure. For us at Volvo Group, it starts with some facts. You know, you've already seen today, we're a big multicultural company. We're all over the world. We have both employees and customers in those places. And then a belief, and the belief is that we can develop our ability to work together across these cultural and national barriers. And that we would do that by establishing teams to take maximum advantage of the strength that we can have from the diversity within the team. So bringing together the knowledge, the experience, and the perspectives of people across the globe.
Great. And then Laura, what do you want to say about from a Polestar perspective?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, these are my own opinions and experiences. And that being said, I think Polestar was a little bit of a different experience, because when I joined, there wasn't an IP function, and innovation was just kind of starting to get off the ground. So it's also taking into context taking into consideration the context of the company too. It was a very process and policy resistant company. And so trying to fit diversity into all of that and inclusion was very interesting. That being said, I think it really highlighted the high impact that an individual can have, or the individuals can have, which I hope will also bring up some unconscious bias, which hopefully I think Mike and I are discussing later. But yeah, we really broke it down into 3 different areas. And the first one was external partners and collaborators. The department was really small, and so much of our time and energy from the IP side happened through and with our external partners. And then the second piece was decentralization of the diversity and inclusion responsibility. So really pushing ownership out to everyone else in the group. And then finally, inclusion, which I think everyone has touched on so far, but really part of how we did that was before we would go in to talk to teams, making sure we would start with a brief training on building psychological safety, and making sure that folks across the board felt safe and seen when embracing new and unique ideas. And part of that also was including making sure the trainers and the speakers and the lawyers who were speaking to them were of diverse representation. And again, part of that is, yes, what we can see, and part of that is things like neurodiversity and different abilities. Yeah, so that was Polestar.
Great. Well, you know, it's interesting because diversity and inclusion really has 2 main components, right? The first is what we're calling a pipeline, which is the hiring, retention, promoting of certainly women or other underrepresented inventors. And then you have the inclusivity piece, which is how are they being included in actually all of the activities, right? So I think it's interesting that within innovation, both of those things are happening at the same time. So Robertha, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit, talk perhaps about the pipeline, commentary, your views on that first.
Sure. Elkem makes big efforts to attract women. We have a trainee program, and last year the figures were 58% of the trainees were actually women. But this is a case that is, I think it's isolated and it doesn't really reflect reality, because at least in the Scandinavian countries, that are countries that have a high degree of gender equality, when you look at the gap in between men and women for people that choose to study STEM, like science, technology, engineering, and math, you see that this gap, it's very wide, it widens. So I think that we really need to do a lot of work from the beginning, not from tertiary school, but I mean from primary school, because there are a lot of factors that very early on make women afraid of going into education that is technology related. And for example, I want to share, we have a Mexican girl, she's 10 years old, she's a genius. Her IQ is 162, which is 2 points higher than Einstein. And she's currently studying 2 engineering. One is in industrial engineering, and I think the other one is, I can't remember, physics or astronomy, I don't know, something related to space. And she said that she needed a role model to tell her that she could be an engineer. There was this program in Mexico called Science in Estileros. And this is a girl that is technically a genius. And she needed somebody to tell her women can be engineers, women can work with technology. Can you imagine if this is a genius? What about the rest of the normal girls? What can they expect if from the beginning they're preconditioned to go into other careers? So I think that we really need to do a lot. And I think Elkem as a company has been involved. I personally have been involved into going to schools, to secondary schools, to talk about my job and what I studied and what kind of opportunities I could have in Elkem. But I think that so much work needs to be done to improve the pipeline, because another example I can give you, in the 70s, today in the USA, 48% of the population working are women. But the people, these women are not working necessarily with technology. It's only like 27% of the total workforce working with technology. So we really need to improve the pipeline, not just in Elkem, but I think globally. We need to get women more interested into technology and this type of scientific careers. So that was my answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important issue. And I think what's also interesting to note is oftentimes that, I guess, responsibility resides with HR in many companies to find talented women and try to get them brought into the company. But when we think about intellectual property management, what can we do today, either in R&D or IP, with the women that you have? And so I thought we'd maybe turn to you, Tove, so you could talk a little bit from an R&D perspective of your experiences and what you found.
Yep. So when it comes to inclusivity, I think it's important for my personal experience is that it's good that the tools and trainings that we have are really easy accessible for everyone, so that you don't have to be super experienced to know how to send in your ideas. So I think it's good that we have that easily accessible. And then what I also think is important is that we have this supportive culture, so that it's natural for me as a younger engineer to go and talk innovations with more senior colleagues, so that they are really supportive and help with the process and what steps to take when you have some ideas.
Great, thanks. So Laure, do you want to talk a little bit about this, about inclusivity from Philip's point of view?
Yeah, so if we want to look a bit more specifically at R&D and IP, I think we can find maybe indeed more differences between the ratio of men, women, or other diverse backgrounds than in other areas like marketing, for example. But I think the rules or the tricks are a little bit the same. So what we are trying to do is to focus on a number of things we already mentioned, like hiring, but also promotion, retention of diverse talents, as well as compensation, and the diversity of senior leadership and directors, because we really need to have the role models. So in hiring more women, we also make sure that we have also various nationalities, because we want to create teams really with diverse talents. And in R&D, for example, or in IP, diverse backgrounds also means diverse styles. Many years ago, we only had people with 100% hardcore, who were 100% hardcore engineers. And now we see that we are starting to hire a lot more diverse backgrounds like psychologists or medical doctors. Then I want to mention retention. I mentioned it a little bit before, that if you hire women or if you hire people of diverse backgrounds, but you do nothing to retain them, they will leave, and that happens. So you need to make sure that they feel included, and that's where inclusion is very, very important. So we have all kinds of initiatives, like making sure that they feel cared about. So we have a lot of emphasis on caring for each other, but also standing up against racism, supporting Blackout Tuesday, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, LGBT, etc., so that everybody feels really included. Of course, we also have trainings on unconscious bias, identity, health and wellness as well, health and well-being. So all of these is very important. And when we want to be very broad about inclusion, we also say inclusion starts with I. So I can make a difference in making sure that I include everyone. And we have guidelines to help everyone, especially managers, of course, to help us make sure that in every day we are more inclusive. For example, make sure that we expand our circle, broaden our mind, but also educate ourselves about our own unconscious bias, about privileges. We encourage people, for example, to send material in advance of calls, because we know that some people can jump into a meeting without preparation, but others really like to reflect and like to have materials so that they are more comfortable to talk. We also advise people to state clearly their pronouns in their email signature, for example, which I still have to do. But I see that some of my colleagues already have mentioned their pronouns in their signature. Also tips like never assume, always ask, and this type of things. And when you are really clear about all those things that you have to do as a colleague or as a manager, I think it really helps everyone to feel more included.
I agree. And one of the things I notice as we've been here in the US focusing on trying to get companies to actually work on this area, in particular within innovation, is that people feel frustrated because they view it as sort of touchy-feely, right? How does someone feel about being included? Or how do we know if someone's included? And so they can often be dismissive because it sounds a lot like feelings. And so when we launched the Diversity Pledge in the United States, we actually decided to take a data-driven approach. That is to say, we can look and determine how included people are by looking at patent data, right? Because you can see the rate of patenting of men versus women. And while that algorithm came from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, we are working on algorithms for ethnicity. There's questions about people with disabilities, all of the ones, Laura, that you had mentioned earlier. And it really allows companies the ability to focus on whatever diversity means for them, right? They can determine what they want to work on. But what that really means is that the IP groups here in companies have all of that data, and they can actually look at and determine an inclusivity metric. So I want to now focus on that and see, like, Mike, if I turn to you, how do you think about that in the IP group and having that data?
Well, I think when it comes to the data, I'm just speaking for our own situation, we feel like we're part of the answer. We have, obviously, anybody working with IP management has a lot of data, and it's typically very structured. So we can help with things like what's the geographical spread? What are the conversion rates from invention disclosure to filed patents in different geographic areas? We don't necessarily have the gender data. And of course, a lot of the other diversity data is just not available, whether it be LGBT or disability or anything like that. So I think we see it that we're kind of part of the jigsaw puzzle, but not all of it. But I'd like to actually touch back to the last question a bit about also what an IP department can do to improve inclusivity and diversity. Because I think I like what was said about the capital I. I think everybody that can do something makes a difference. It's almost a bit like climate change. You know, everybody needs to take responsibility and do their own thing. So from the IP point of view, I think what we can do is make a conscious effort to include female engineers when we run workshops. And that's just not just the right thing to do, but it actually is good for the workshop in terms of increasing the diversity of the people that we have there. So that's one thing. And I think recruitment as well. I'm proud to say that my team is 50% gender split. And it is something that I think about whenever we're recruiting, very much. So I think the I really like that, is super important, taking that responsibility.
Great. And Laura, you were talking about at Polestar that that the IP function was even a relatively new function. So you had some opportunity. I mean, you had a lot of building, it sounds like, that you had to do. So how did you incorporate maybe a D&I perspective into that?
Yeah, I think it really informs everything we do. And I think going back to the data piece too, I think that is incredibly relevant, because a lot of times when we're coming in and speaking with the R&D folks or other folks in the organization, they see IP as, especially like hard IP or patents, as like very, very data driven. In many aspects we have access to so much data. And also I think because we have that, that feels like that's a credibility that we already have or can very quickly establish. It feels like for me, it's given space and opportunity to more openly talk about the maybe feelings part, or like the human element of what we're dealing with. And that's where, while we can't or maybe wouldn't want to be tracking all of these visible and invisible diversity pieces, we can also we can see what works and what doesn't work, right? We can see where our filing is at. We can see where, if we're getting an increase or decrease in just touch points with our R&D team and who's talking to us. So I think that was one kind of concrete piece, but I think overall, one of the underlying pieces in inclusivity, in trying to build this culture, was just acknowledging the different hurdles that non-majority folks, I would say, are going to experience in any area of IP, be it from accessing what Tove was saying a little bit, accessing some of the patenting tools, to speaking out, to the whole, I think, psychological piece of coming forward with an idea, right, or advocating for your idea. And then bringing in like a cultural humility piece there of saying, and also we're acknowledging these hurdles, and also acknowledging that as individuals, we don't know what hurdles folks are experiencing, and actually turning the conversation over to them, creating the spaces where they can tell us where the obstacles are in them accessing whatever it is within the IP space that they're interested in learning or interested in contributing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we tend to forget that, the intellectual property system was designed for men who were the people that were actually doing it several hundred years ago. And so as we bring in other individuals into this system, it wasn't optimized for that. So it's not surprising that it doesn't fit exactly with how women or people of color or other underrepresented inventors work. Robertha, I know you've been a big champion from the IP group, and you want to talk a little bit about that? How has that worked for you?
Can you repeat the question, please?
No, I just, having the IP group have the data, how has that helped you champion this concept within Elkem?
Okay, I have talked to our diversity manager that she's new. She started in July, and I discussed the diversity pledge with her. So we have signed a diversity pledge, and we will provide the data. And I think I also will take the opportunity to cooperate and work closely with her, because there is a lot of statistics about Elkem. She gave me a lot of statistics, but none of it included the share of female researchers. So I think that we should start by knowing how many women are researchers. And then the second thing I would like to do with her is that maybe we should do some webinars to target specifically our research women. And maybe, I don't know, like from the presentation from Katrine today, maybe have something similar to explain to them that, okay, language has shaped a lot of how women think about technology, and just make them aware that things that they're working on may be inventions, but they're probably not aware of it. So I would like to just make awareness on how we communicate about technology, because I don't have the data, but I know who are the inventors, and I haven't done calculations, but of course I know that I can tell you who are the women inventors. I can count them, and it's not more than 6. So we have an issue there. And so I think we need to work with our researchers, because I'm pretty sure that maybe we have some errors, maybe we have overlooked, maybe in a patent application there was a woman included as well as an inventor, but we didn't see it. So I think I would like to also look at that, how we done errors, how we left out the women from a patent application. So that's what I would like to do.
Great. Well, it's very interesting, because we're finding as we go around and talk with companies that within their D&I initiatives, they don't have very good metrics of inclusivity. They have lots of things on hiring and promotion and retention, and most companies have been doing that for a long time, and they're quite good at it. But when we talk about, well, how are women or other underrepresented inventors included, the data tells a different story. And I'll say this: Bo and I were recently talking with a woman who was the head of an R&D group in a large pharmaceutical, and she was saying that she didn't think they had a D&I problem, because they hired a lot of women. They had really good retention. They had excellent training programs. And we said, that's probably all true. But when we look at your numbers of the amount of women are patenting in your research, it's well below what the percentage of women in the group is. So why are they patenting less than your male colleagues? And she said, oh, I guess maybe we have some issues. So again, there's a difference between perception, and sometimes data can help shape that story a little differently than we might want it to be, or than it appears. So Tove, I want to talk a little bit, because you're in the R&D group and you've become a prolific inventor at Volvo Group. And I want to hear your thoughts on what more could be done within innovation to make it more inclusive, or how do you want to, how to increase diversity?
Yeah, I've been reflecting a bit what has helped me for working with IP. And like I mentioned before, having the team that supports me and making sure that I know the IP process that has helped me, and just knowing the tool makes the step a lot smaller when you send in an idea. If you have an idea and you have no idea what to do with it, it could be a bigger step to act on it. So that's one thing. I also think that it's good to clarify that there's a balance between being done with the calculations and pre-work and actually sending in the idea. Because me as a calculation engineer, I really like being done with my calculations and really preparing everything. That might make me not send in my idea. So really encouraging that there's a balance here when it comes to IP. And I think that doesn't just go for me as an engineer, that I like everything to be done and finished and perfect when I send it in. I think it relates to me as a woman as well. And then a third thing I've been reflecting on is what we mentioned before, really having this company culture which encourages IP, so that you know that your company supports that you put time on this and that it's valued, that people in the department talk about it, people in the team talk about that this is something we're working with, and this is something we value, because it will take time from your other calculations or simulations that you're doing, if that's your daily work. And also encouraging teamwork and really including that you can work together with IP, I think also could help for inclusivity and getting more women into IP, that you start working together with more experienced people, and at least that has helped me to get into IP.
Great. And you know, it's interesting that kind of building on some of your thoughts, what we found certainly in the US is that language matters here. So in many instances, the word inventor, a lot of women don't feel they rise to an inventor, right? That's Marie Curie, that's Thomas Edison, who's prolific. There are all those things, but they just solve problems. So many companies and IP groups are actually beginning to change that word inventor and just ask people, what problems have you solved? What are you working on? And that seems a much lower bar. It's like, oh, well, I'm solving problems every day, as opposed to I'm an inventor. And that helps, I think, make it more accessible so people see themselves as part of this process. I don't know, Laure, can you tell a little bit maybe about how you guys are thinking about this at Philips, and you know, how are you bringing more women in, do you think, to this process?
Yeah, so it's interesting what you said about lowering the bar, because although I don't have statistics, at least I don't have statistics with me now, but I have observed and I have spoken with some women inventors, but also women in management positions within R&D, who really told me that the number of women inventors have drastically increased over the years at Philips. And I can also see that to some extent in the inventors' names. But what I have also observed many times is that almost every time when there are women inventors in a patent application, they are cited together with the whole team. I see less women inventor alone in the patent applications that we receive compared with men. So men tend to maybe more often work alone than in teams. And yeah, almost 100% of the times when we receive an invention, or maybe not 100%, but certainly more than 50% when a women inventor are cited, they are together with the whole team. So I have not yet had the time to dig deeper into this, but that might, yeah, indeed say something about the way they work, but also indeed, maybe we need to lower the bar and encourage them more to also dare to invent alone, and that would probably bring us a lot more inventions from women. Another thing that I would like to add, and maybe in certain aspects or certain geographies it's a little bit taboo, but I think compensation and promotion, but yeah, just thinking about compensation is very important. Yeah, it's very well known that in many countries, but also many companies, there is still a gap in compensation between men and women. So again, here at Philips, we now can say that we have fair compensation between men and women, but maybe that was not always the case in the past. And compensation being linked to promotion, we also noticed that women tend to leave earlier in their career. So they didn't stay long enough, or they didn't stay as long as men in R&D. And we believe that it also has had to do with a lack of promotion or lower pay. And what we also know is that maybe unless exceptions, usually it needs time to become a prolific inventor. You need to get expertise on your knowledge, but also you need to get familiar with the process of submitting an idea, etc. So we have noticed that the most prolific inventors are usually in the company for many years, and women tended to stay less long. So that might also explain why in the past we had less women inventors. But apparently we have all of this.
Sorry, I was going to say again, I think this is where beginning to unpack the problem can help us better understand why these things are happening. I know that many companies that in the US who sign the pledge have been talking about when they go out and query, say, their women inventors to understand why they may not be participating in the system at the same rate. You know, they thought that they had the answer. They thought they knew why it was. And it turns out that it's multifaceted, right? Not all women are monolithic and have the same reasoning, but some of those factors are that women are self-selecting out, that they don't think their ideas meet the criteria of an invention, and so they aren't submitting them. It can also be that, as you said, you know, oftentimes inventors are doing their applications or disclosures after hours of the office, whether at work or at home. And most women are frankly busy doing their third shift, right? Like taking care of the family, doing all that other stuff, and they didn't have time. So when you change maybe your IP processes to do some of the innovation work or disclosure work in the office, they tend to find more pickup and more women participating, because that's part of what now they can do on the time for work. So these are small ideas that seem to have some large impacts. And the other thing I would say is that, again, the power of data here, you just can't talk about how helpful it is. I was recently talking with a company in the US, and they had looked at collaborations among the R&D groups, both on a peer-to-peer basis, but also looking 2 levels up. And what they found was that on a peer-to-peer basis, men and women collaborated equally. There was no problem. But when you looked 2 levels up, managers were not collaborating with younger women. And so as they would pick interesting projects, management would say, here's an important project we need to work on, and they would assemble a team. Women were almost exclusively shut out of those teams because men were working with people that they either knew or who they felt had experience in doing this before. And so what that happened was then there was no interaction between multiple levels up of managers and women. So therefore women weren't getting promoted because they weren't being put on the teams and getting the recognition. The data that this group with the IP group was able to assemble showed very clearly these lack of interactions between management and the lower ranks. And they were able to take that to their management and the board and go back into R&D and actually show what unconscious bias was doing, so that they could actually now address this and make sure those teams were done differently to include women, so that they could then be promoted as they got more experience and went through it. So I think we really need to think about how we can use this data to actually visualize these problems or issues that are happening in new and different ways, right? And in particularly unconscious bias, because that's so hard to think about. I mean, we all have unconscious biases. I mean, if we know about them, they become conscious, right? So how do we actually help address that? So Mike, I know you had some thoughts on unconscious bias, and I wonder if you could share that with us.
Yeah, sure. It kind of starts from the point of view that diversity is not just gender and LGBT and that kind of thing, but it's also cultural diversity. So if we think about Volvo Group as being a big company all over the world, and then thinking about my own personal experience working as an IP manager, working with those teams around the world, what I actually realized over years of reflection was that, you know, if an invention disclosure comes in from a so-called star inventor, I just kind of trust that it's going to be good and probably don't examine it in any detail, like, unless I'm curious and have some time and think, oh, I wonder what that person's come up with now. So it goes through into the process. Whereas if an invention disclosure comes from somewhere I'm not aware of, and that probably is a different country, it could be Poland, it could be Brazil, it could be France or whatever, I'm probably more likely to scrutinize it if it's somebody I don't know. And just the fact that I scrutinize it, it isn't to defeat the invention disclosure or exclude it, but the fact that I scrutinize it means that some won't make it through this filter that I've created. So it kind of becomes this unconscious bias. And I have some, you know, direct real life experiences of this. There was a stage whenever I was working with one particular part of Volvo Group and started to get a lot of invention disclosures from Poland. An organization in Poland, I didn't know them. They started sending in things that were definitely very creative, but it wasn't clear to me looking at it how they really related to what was needed by the company. So I started really examining them in a lot of detail. And after some weeks or months, I realized, you know what, when I look at what they've submitted, I'm only allowing a certain percentage through and they must be really demoralized. So in fact, they approached me, the innovation managers from that team approached me and kind of, what can we do to get better success rate? And I realized that actually, totally unconsciously, I was probably not really helping them at all by creating this filter or screen. So I started working together with that group and going there several times, talking to the people there, and together we got to know each other. We built this trust. They started writing invention disclosures in a way that was a bit more business focused, like this is why it's important for Volvo Group, instead of this is just an interesting idea. And we overcame the hurdle. So it's kind of a personal story I'm not proud of in a way. I realized that I was doing something that probably wasn't good, but at least I managed to fix it in that case. And I think all of us have these, just like you said, all of us have these unconscious biases. That's not so easy to say. But sometimes I think we need to actually point out to each other as well when we notice them in other people's behaviors.
We just have a quick few minutes here, but I wanted to ask, what does diversity mean in Europe? Because in the United States, what we've done is we've allowed companies to self-define, and it's really focused on gender and ethnicity and LGBTQ, a little bit about veterans or just people with disabilities. And I noticed that here in Europe, that's not exactly how you all talk about it. So I'm wondering, you know, Laure, do you have some thoughts about that from, say, a Philips perspective?
Yeah, Philips being very global, I think, yeah, we also have a very global way to look at it. So what you mentioned indeed, yeah, is very familiar, although probably it comes, of course, from the US. So that's something that in Europe we may talk a bit less, although, again, because our programs are all global, it will, yeah, affect all of us. But maybe if I talk about my own experience, I would probably mention things like personality, for example, introverts versus extroverts, education. We all have, especially in certain countries, a very strong idea about, yeah, what is a really good education to become a top engineer. So we have ranks of the best universities in France or in Europe. And when I receive a resume of someone who is graduated from one of these universities, I am biased, of course, because I believe that, yeah, he will be, yeah, he's very intelligent and he will be a great inventor, for example. But also value systems. I think that also is something that is very present. And I already see the differences between Dutch and French and Chinese. So all of this, yeah, is something we really pay a lot of attention. We try to pay more attention in order not to discard people because they are a little bit more shy, or because they speak less comfortably, or because their level of English, language is also important, level of English is not as good as others. So sometimes, yeah, it gives the impression that the person is less smart. So we really try to pay attention to all of these things, which are indeed below the waterline of visibility.
Well, thank you. I can see that our time is coming to an end, and I would just want to thank the panel for all of your openness about this topic, and also to tune in tomorrow, because we're going to spend a lot more time actually delving into how to increase diversity and innovation and what companies are actually doing, so we can show some of that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Suzanne.